From the heartland of America, it's the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf. Executive producer, David Stuckman.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 38 years. Now, public policy is often a compromise between competing or even conflicting interests. Do we take one person's land to build the park? How much should we tax people? Is it fair to tax the wealthy at much higher rates than the poor? What are the potential downstream effects of raising or lowering taxes? Do we criminalize one type of negative activity while not punishing another type of negative activity? Marijuana versus alcohol is sort of an example here. How do we come to decisions on these types of questions? Now, there is a field of study called PPE, which, given recent COVID issues, it does not stand for personal protective equipment. Rather, it stands for philosophy, politics, and economics. And when I was looking at this, I was struck by how this sort of training can be helpful in wrestling with these difficult decisions about public policy. So, to describe my initial impression of this in an overly simplistic way and probably inaccurate, but philosophy is ethics and morals, meaning of life kind of theories of stuff. People supporting or opposing policies often claim to have some moral standing for doing so. In terms of bail, so-called bail reformers will claim that it's immoral to hold people in custody who haven't yet been convicted. And then you have economics, which in this sort of linear way I'm looking at this is sort of the opposite end of that pole, more practical or amoral, for lack of a better term in this context, crunching numbers to see if your philosophy can actually work in real life. And politics is how we reach some sort of balance or compromise between these two poles, the theory and the practice. Now, as I said, that's overly simplistic. It's not nearly so clear-cut. Economists are not simply bean counters, and philosophers are not aesthetics dispensing wisdom from a mountaintop. Economic theories are often underpinned by a specific moral or ethical grounding, and many philosophies are little more than fleshed out economic plans. So it's not really an either or situation. There's sort of a blending of all that. But since I have an Idiot's Guide to Understanding Ethics book behind me, and my guest has a PhD in economics, I'm sure he can explain the nuances better than I possibly could. Dr. Alex Tabarrok is the director of the Center for Study of Public Choice, the Bartley J. Madden Chair in Economics at the Mercatus Center, which is part of George Mason University. He is also the author of several textbooks on economics, and he's the co-founder of Marginal Revolution University, which can be found at mru.org, and the accompanying blog, which is really interesting, at marginalrevolution.com, which has almost 2,500 pages on an incredible variety of topics. Law, of course, being one topic that I particularly enjoy reading. There are also links to podcasts and other media from the Mercatus Center. Doctor, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Well, now, since I've probably butchered what exactly PPE is, when we say economics, I think most people think of supply and demand and maybe the stock market and not a whole lot else. Can you clean up my mess about PPE and economics? What does an economist do?
No, I think you nailed it. I mean, I think we would say trade-offs are everywhere. No solutions, just trade-offs. And what economists do is they try and estimate, document, try and understand, try and think about what are the trade-offs we face when we make decisions. And that often involves, throwing cold water on utopian plans to, the utopian plans, they only see benefits, never costs. And economists come along and say, oh, what about this? What about this? What are the trade-offs? What are the opportunity costs? So that's one of the reasons we are called the dismal science.
Well, I mean, you can go down the road if you don't look at the dismal science, I guess, and end up in a place far more dismal than that. Now,
For sure.
like most of us in what I refer to as bail world, I first came across your work in your 2004 paper with Dr. Eric Helen. It's called "The Fugitive Evidence on Public versus Private Law Enforcement from Bail Jumping." Um, Can you tell us a little bit more about that study? I mean, I've looked at it and I've used it multiple times, but kind of enlighten us a little bit about what the study shows.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you well know, when a accused defendant, comes up for trial, the judge has a number of options to release them before trial, including being released on their own recognizance, or alternatively being released on bail, and that might often be a commercial bail. Now, so the question we were asking is, what difference does this make in how similar defendants are treated if they're released on their own recognizance, maybe they're released on government bail, or maybe they're released on commercial bail? And what we found is that looking at, again, similar defendants, similar backgrounds, similar strikes against them, and so forth, what we found is that defendants who are released on commercial bail are, first of all, they're much more likely to show up for trial in the first place. Okay. It was astounding to me when I first began researching this issue that 20 to 25% of people just don't show up on the day of the trial. This is like amazing to me, and is considerably lower for people who are released on commercial bail. The second thing we found is that if the defendant does abscond, they don't show up for trial, then we really have two systems come into play. The people who have been released on their own recognizance, they're chased by the police. The people who are released on commercial bail, well, they're chased, traced and chased by the bounty hunters, by the bail enforcement agents. And what we found is that the defendants who are out on commercial bail, they are much more likely to be caught and caught quickly than the people who abscond while being on their own recognizance or on deposit bond or government bail of one kind or another.
So earlier we talked about trying to balance, conflicting priorities. At least that was in my little prologue there. In terms of bail, historically, this has been an attempt to balance the interest of the defendant, and obviously the defendant would be interested in freedom before conviction, against the idea that the defendant will actually show up for trial to determine guilt or innocence. And as you noted in your study, that a quarter of the people, and keep in mind, this was almost 30 years ago, that a quarter of the people didn't show up for trial, or at some court appearance in the course of the case. I think the data we're seeing now is that has gone up dramatically in areas where they've not been using bail. But bail also involves giving the defendant an adequate assurance that he will appear for trial and submit to the sentence. So when economists are looking at these things, this sort of balancing of interests here, what do they look for when they're evaluating this sort of policies, and how do you place values on one over the other, or do we just look at this completely amorally and go, okay, well, this works? I mean, you can make the argument that keeping people in custody indefinitely while the case is ongoing,
Mhm.
that has a very positive effect on appearance rates, because you don't miss court if you're sitting in custody. If you let everybody go, it's on completely on the other end of things. I mean, we're seeing 60-75% failure to appear rates in some of these zero bail areas. So how does the economist, when making that evaluation, how do they place their value judgment and reach that point that they want to reach in making the evaluation?
Yeah. So So before I get to that, let me just put this a little bit in context, because I think
Okay,
the context has changed, and it's quite interesting in how it has changed. Because the bail system goes back to, medieval England.
sure,
And at the time, the standard practice was that somebody who was accused of a crime would be held in jail until a judge could come by. And these were roving judges.
right.
And it might take months for a judge to show up in your small little hamlet and to make a ruling. But that was the standard. Then people began to say, well, it's not quite fair. The person has to stay in jail, blah, 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 blah. So they developed the surety system. And initially, the surety system worked in the following way: is that your brother, maybe, or your father, would guarantee that you would show up when the roving judge came into town and that you would show up for your trial. And the initial way that this was guaranteed was that if the defendant didn't show up, the father or the brother would literally be judged in their place.
Right.
Okay? So this gave your brother a really strong incentive to make sure that you didn't skip town and leaving him having to face the judge. And after a while, they began saying, "Oh, well, that's also not quite so fair. The brother didn't actually do it, you know." So
Right.
they developed this idea of you would put up cash, and in the American system, you began to borrow the cash from a bail bondsman. Now, the point of bringing up this history is that initially, bail was seen as a very progressive measure because the status quo was everyone stays in jail.
Right.
So bail and the surety system was something which got people out of jail. And people thought, oh, this is a great thing. This is, an improvement over the status quo. And then we come to the United States and we come to, the 1960s in particular, where we had a big liberal courts, not in a pejorative sense, but that's how they ruled on criminal justice issues. This is when the beginnings of the Miranda, rulings and the exclusionary rule on evidence. All of these things date back to the 1960s in the courts. And the default in people's minds began to be, well, maybe everyone should be released on their own recognizance. That at least seemed to be sort of the natural default that people began to think about. And if you think about it from that perspective, now suddenly it looks as if bail is a regressive measure. It's something
Right.
which keeps people in jail, particularly if they can't afford it, or the high bail, or something like that. So just by changing how people thought about the default, that changed a lot how people thought about the bail system. But I think it's important to recognize that you could think about this as a progressive system or as a regressive system. So that's kind of the background. Now to think about these trade-offs. Yeah, there's a lot of things which bail does. As I mentioned from my study, it makes people more likely to show up. It provides uh, a natural system in which you have people who are incentivized, the bail enforcement agents, to recapture people. And that's a system which the public doesn't pay for. That's a system which the people who abscond pay for. So it's a very nice savings to the taxpayer. You don't have the police going after these people. You have the bail enforcement agents. That's a nice property. And, this is a way of creating justice. I think the long arm of the law often is the bounty hunter. They're the true long arm of the law. So you get some justice. On the other hand, there are costs. There are costs to the bail system. I mean, if you are in jail, then it's more difficult to mount a defense.
Right.
And it is, of course, it's you've been deprived of your liberty, and it's more difficult to maintain a job, of course, obviously. And if you're not maintaining a job, then you maybe, even if you're declared innocent later on, it's difficult to get back into the workplace. So there are big costs. So we need to be thinking about all kind of aspects and weighing these and presenting them really to the public and asking them, here are the trade-offs. Where do you want to locate? So it's not really the economist's job. It's not my job to say we should be here, but it's my job to say, if you move in this direction, this is what the cost is going to be. If you allow more people released on their own recognizance, fewer people are going to show up. It's going to be more costly to recapture these people. Justice is going to be delayed and perhaps justice denied. On the other hand, if you release more people, then you have some savings and you have greater liberty. You have people more attached to the workforce, perhaps things of this nature. So we need to kind of give the public the right information in order to let them balance these trade-offs.
Well, and that's one of the things that I think we see a lot in our Facebook legal discussions is, the same people that are arguing, well, this person hasn't been convicted, so they shouldn't be in custody at all. Well, next week when it's some child victim crime, then why is this person even getting out of jail? And so there's not always a whole lot of consistency from the public on those sorts of decisions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there has been, I think the public is being somewhat misled in a way by many of the people who are arguing to eliminate cash bail, because what they tend to go is sort of the perfect, the ideal kind of defendant, and they say, look, this person was charged with a misdemeanor. Okay, it's not even a felony, it's a misdemeanor. And then they couldn't get, they couldn't raise the money for bail. And so they were kept in jail. And people think, oh, well, that could have been me, right? I could have committed a misdemeanor, a driving infraction. What would happen to me? And that's okay. That, however, is not actually what's going on. That's not the predominant case. The person who is accused of one misdemeanor and who ends up not being able to make bail, that is not by any means the predominant case. Uh, Most of the people who are involved with the criminal justice system have many cases against them already. So what happens is a judge will see somebody. Yes, it's a misdemeanor case, but they'll see this person has 3 or 4 misdemeanors against them already, and they haven't shown up for any of them. So
Right.
the judge is saying, like, what am I supposed to do? Just let them out again, and then they're not gonna show up again. This is the 4th or 5th time this has happened. They have a string of misdemeanors. Each one of them, you might say, "Okay, it's just a misdemeanor. What's the big deal?" 4 or 5 of them, well, that's criminal, that's serious criminal activity, really. And so eventually the judges get tired of this and they assign a high bail, and maybe that person can't make bail, but they're not a random selection. The people who cannot make bail typically have 4 or 5 or more cases against them already. They've already failed to appear on previous trials, and they have a lot of criminal history. So I think that is actually the modal case is the person with a long criminal history who finally the judge says enough is enough. We're going to give a high bail on this one.
Well, I mean, there's an argument that's been made that, a prison sentence, is as actually a lifetime achievement award in criminality. You generally, the first thing that you do, particularly if it's nonviolent, they're not sending you to prison for that. It's a lifetime of these things until your criminal history gets built up so much. I think the same thing's gonna be happening if you have minor charges, but you're being required to give some sort of financial bail. It's because you have a history of, not abiding by your bail agreements or something else along, or you don't have any connection to the area. I mean, we're in the Midwest, and so we see some people, that, get marijuana in Colorado and are driving it back to Indiana or wherever they happen to be. Those people don't have any connection to this area, and so what are the likelihoods that they're going to come back if they're given, no assurance that they'll be back? So, let's see if I can, stir the pot a little bit here. You mentioned that there were some, anti-bail people, and maybe we were given, bad information. Um, Megan Stevenson is one of the other leading economic or economists. They're probably on the anti-bail voices. She's authored studies like "Does Cash Bail Deter Misconduct?" and in that study, she actually even claims that does not financial bail does not increase appearance, which is directly counter to your conclusion. And another article, "Distortion of Justice: How the Inability to Pay Affects Case Outcomes," and in that study, basically claims that the inability to post bail was causal in a defendant receiving an incarceration sentence. And I saw that you'd written criticism of some of her other work on police interventions, that like hotspot policing, does that really work? Without expecting you to have an encyclopedic knowledge of all these studies. So why is she wrong on bail issues? Not leading or anything there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't think she's entirely wrong.
Right.
As we talked about earlier, there are definitely trade-offs, which I think people need to be, aware of. And it is, you know, for if somebody, as I said, fails to make bail, and they are more likely, probably. I think it's probably true that they're more likely to end up being convicted. Maybe that's because, it's harder to meet with your lawyer, it's harder to have a job, it's more difficult to, make your case. Maybe it's because for some of these guys, not but for all of them, but for some of them, if you're out on the streets and you can go intimidate witnesses, right? And, you can put out the word that, snitches get stitches, then your witnesses, for the crime suddenly disappear. And you can certainly understand how in many high crime areas, you're going to be as a witness or as a victim, you're going to be much more worried about testifying against somebody at trial if they're out on the street. If this
Sure.
is somebody that, you could bump into, at the coffee shop, right? Uh, so, exactly what's going on there, I don't think we totally know. But I do think there are legitimate reasons to always be thinking about, are there other ways in which we can navigate this trade-off, which respond to both? So, for example, we have in the Constitution a right to a speedy trial,
Right.
and yet that is ignored all of the time. Our court system is very slow, and it's shocking to me that, the liberal activist lawyers, sometimes they do some good things. One of the things that they could do is demand speedy trials, and I think that would, help, navigate both of these trade-offs, because if you're not in jail, you're held on bail, but it's a short period of time, and then you're sent, to trial, and you're judged guilty or innocent, it's done with. The real problem, right, is when you're held on bail, and then because the court system is so slow that it's weeks or months or years before you get a trial.
Right.
And that to me is outrageous. So I think part of the problem is, we need to actually invest more in our court system, so to alleviate the judges and, make sure that the court system is keeping up with the amount of crime that we see.
Well, I agree, but in the counter to that as well is, and I've seen these instances where they demand a speedy trial and judge like, well, sorry, we don't have anything open to do that for 120 days, and you're 90 days, and so since the court doesn't have the availability, you're not going to get your speedy trial, and since we didn't have the availability, it's not going to be a dismissal. Um, but also there's the idea that time is the defendant's friend. Memories
Yeah,
fade, witnesses
yeah,
move, police officers get in trouble and get fired. And so oftentimes, the defense, it's a defense tactic to delay and extend that time out because in the end that they view that as beneficial to the defendant. Now, not always. Now, obviously, if you have to sit in custody for an extended period of time, but if you're also looking at a 10-year sentence on something, does it really matter if you sit for 2 years if ultimately that case gets dismissed or
yeah,
witness disappears? The other factor, and I know this is something that economists have to do, is try and get the right matching. And when you're trying to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, um, a lot of times the reason that people are not able to bond is because the case against them is stronger to begin with. And the judges actually, and actually the New Jersey situation looked at this and the court system there said, yeah, we don't really buy that because what that means is the judge is making a proper decision. Because I've sat there and said, hey, you're more of a risk to be convicted, more of a risk to failure to appear, so I'm going to have a higher bond. Maybe you can't post that bond. It just means we were right in the first place in setting our bond. That was their argument, the counter argument on that.
yeah. I mean, I think that's all, correct. I mean, you I'll see a lot of the time people, they see, oh, this person got the bail was unaffordable.
Right.
Yeah, the judge made it unaffordable, okay? The judge decided that, "Look, this guy has failed to appear so many times before that we're gonna set a really high bail." It's not an accident. It's not sort of random, I mean, that may happen, that some judge is really cranky one day and he gives somebody a really high bail, but most of the time what's going on is that, uh, judges see somebody who is, A, likely to flee, they've done it before, be likely, to commit another crime, and so they set a high bail for a reason, It's not random. Like I have some data from New York. The average defendant who doesn't make bail has 6 previous felony arrests and 4 previous failures to appear. 4 previous failures to appear, 6 previous felony arrests. I mean, I think people involved in the criminal justice system, they understand this very well. I think
Sure.
the public does not understand it. The public, I think, would be shocked. And they're shocked to learn, like, the people who are released, most people, right? Most people are released. Uh, but the ones who are released, even them, so on average, each arrested person had a 3.2 prior felony arrests and 5 prior misdemeanor arrests, right? So even the guys who are released, they've got a long criminal history. That is the modal defendant. We saw recently, there was a piece in the New York Times, um, that uh, something like uh, 95% of all of the shoplifting was being conducted by a just small, very small group of people,
Sure.
you know? And so what happens is that why do these people have so many arrests or failures to be? Because crime is their job. Crime is their job. And so they're arrested and then they're released and they go back to their job. They go back, commit another crime. So that's really what's going on. And we have a small number of people who are very criminogenic.
Well, and I think I've seen some studies that say that as little as 6% of the population is responsible for 50% of all the crimes that are committed,
Yeah.
or at least
Yeah.
that are charged. And then, the other 50% of that is spread over the remaining 94% of the total population. So I mean, it's certainly as bail bondsman, it's not uncommon to have multiple repeat clients. I mean, people that come in and out, the system repeatedly. Now, not for 14 murders or anything like that, but I mean, if you shoplift or if you have a temper and anger control issue, it's not uncommon for you. Well, I got convicted of this domestic violence charge here, and a couple 3 years later with my new girlfriend, well, that situation then repeats itself, and you end up back in custody. So,
Absolutely. I had a chance to go out. Dennis So, I don't know if you know Dennis up in Baltimore, but
no,
yeah, he took me out. He's a bail bondsman. He took me out to see what it's actually like. Okay, get the professor, out of the classroom, out of the study hall, and into the real world. So we went out and did some bounty hunting, and but he told me, yeah, I asked him, like, why are you so polite? Because the interactions between the bail enforcement agents and their clients are much more polite than between those and the police. And so you see this on the Dog the Bounty Hunter show if you watch that.
sure.
He's very eager to capture them, but once he's captured them, you know, uh, Dog likes to build a rapport. And I asked Dennis, why are you so polite to these guys? Well, because they're my business relies on repeat customers. Okay, and he was telling me one of his clients said that uh, my family has been coming to Frank's bail bonds for 3 generations.
Well, I guess that's a positive.
Yeah,
Well, but you've also got the other aspect is basically you're taking a person and you're putting them back into custody in amongst a group of other people who are going to need your services as well. And you don't
right,
necessarily want them to go sit in a cell with 20 other guys going, this guy's the biggest jerk in the world.
right,
I mean,
right,
if they've
right,
missed court, they generally know that, what the issue is, and they don't always take it personal sometimes. Um,
right.
but yeah, so you
Yeah,
don't want to basically throw that person back into your client mix and have them just sour the entire group against you.
Exactly. I think that's also an aspect of the bail bond system, which a lot of people don't understand. I've talked about capturing these people and recapturing them, and that, of course, is what you see on television. That's the sexy part
Right.
of it. But actually, a lot of what is going on, as you well know, is that the bail bondsmen understand the system, much better than the clients do. And so what they're often doing is helping their clients to navigate the system and to remind them, that you have a court gate, they call them up and, send them a text. Don't forget you have to be at court at this time in this place. These people are not necessarily putting it on their Google Calendar, right? And so the bail bondsmen are, they're really, uh, part of they really perform a service in helping people to navigate the intricacies of the criminal justice system, which at a time of high stress, which is something which is not nobody wants to do, it's not an easy thing to do, but uh, they're a guide, and I think they perform a very useful social service by doing that.
Well, and one thing that's always really struck me is how many different aspects of the criminal justice system that we would touch upon, that most people don't like. We have to deal with the police, we have to deal with the jail, we have to deal with the courts, probation officers, the clerks. I mean, every different aspect of it, we've got some sort of interaction with those people because of what we do. Whereas if you're the prosecutor, you might only be dealing with, the police or the defense attorney, that sort of thing. I mean, you're not necessarily, and prosecutor is going to deal with more, but other people, criminal defense attorneys, they don't have to deal with, like, the people doing electronic monitoring. It's like, "Okay, well,
Right.
here's the hoops we have to jump through to get this done." And so it's just really surprising. It's interesting in from a job perspective because it gives you a whole bunch of different experiences as part of the same job. It's not just widget here, widget here, widget here. So that makes it more interesting, but the different aspects you touch on, I think Michael Connolly, one of his books was sort of critical. The bondsman, bail bondsman, decided and described himself as the grease that makes the system work, and of
Yeah.
course he was really focusing on the grease because that was, sort of as opposed to oil. Um, Anyway, I don't wanna get off on Michael Connolly, although I do like his books. A couple weeks ago, you posted a podcast that I think you may have done in July with your Marginal Revolution, partner, Tyler Cowen, discussing the 1970s crime wave. And
Right.
there were several points you made, and I'd like to talk about that some more, but one of which you made was your concern that we could currently be at, like, another inflection point that could cause crime to increase dramatically again. Um, One of the things, and you just this morning, you retweeted, David Frum, and, this was a quote that I found really interesting. He said, "In the years after 2012, many jurisdictions decided to test whether the policies that wrecked so many cities in the middle and late 1960s would wreck them again if tried again. The experiment yielded the answer, yes. Yes, they would." So, what are your thoughts on what we're doing here as it relates to crime, and are we looking at potentially a repeat of what happened in the 1970s?
Yeah, this is part of what, my colleague Tyler Cowen and I call the great forgetting,
Ah,
right?
yes.
Yeah, people don't remember. Um, uh, but the increase in crime in the 1960s and 1970s up until the 1990s was just tremendous, was just huge. I mean, we went in a matter of 10 years, the crime rates increased by a factor of 4. Murder rates in New York City went up by a factor of 4 or 5 or more. This is when also you had incredibly the number of serial killers. This era of the 1960s and 1970s, John Wayne Gacy and all of these guys, political assassinations, that was part of it. So it wasn't just street crime. Well, street crime was huge, but when we think about the movies today, like The Joker, I mean, that's all based upon New York City in the 1970s when the power. I think it was 74. To the entire city went out, and there were mass riots. It's like the purge, the anarchy,
Right.
right? And uh, the serial killers on the street and all of this kind of stuff. This actually happened. This actually happened. And people kind of forget that. And, you know, crime increased until the 1990s, and then it began to fall. And thank goodness for that. It has fallen a lot. It has fallen a lot. And as crime began to fall, people began to say, hey, maybe we put too many people in jail, which is understandable, but there was a reason for that.
Right.
There was a reason why we became a mass incarceration society, and it was because, the crime rates just skyrocketed and people were afraid, and they had good reasons. They had good reasons to be afraid. So when we look back and we say, "Well, today we're putting too many people in prison," yeah, maybe we are. Maybe we can make some adjustments on the margin. But let's not think that people in the past were just racists. We're just uneducated, high crime, tough on crime people, and now we're more, civilized or something like that. No, people in the past were dealing with a problem which, if we were dealing with the same problem, we would freak out as well. Okay, we're fortunately our crime rates are low, and these seem to be. There has been a recent blip, but they seem to be continuing on that trend. However, coming to your point, if we forget, and I worry that we don't actually have a lot of good explanations for why the crime rate went up so much in the 1960s and 1970s. Part of it, I think, was that the justice system simply became overwhelmed.
Right.
We had some uh, uh, we were moving towards more liberal criminal justice. Okay, and that maybe let people commit a few more crimes, and then they committed a few more crimes, and the police became strained, and the punishment for crime, the effective punishment for crime went down, and so people committed more crimes, and we kind of got it. The ball started rolling down the hill and builds up steam, and we get this big crime wave. And I worry that if we're not careful, that the same thing could happen today. I don't think we're there yet, but what I would like to see is that we maintain our low crime rate and keep doing that by keeping police on the street in particular. I think we're actually an under policed country. You could argue that we're an over-imprisoned country, put more people in prison than maybe we should, but we're definitely an under-policed country. So I would like to see, just to make sure that we keep the lid, on the steam pot and don't let it explode into something which we've seen before.
Well, this is an example that I throw out there all the time because everybody likes to think that their piece of the pie is the most important piece of the puzzle that they're doing here. So in 1966, the federal government enacted the Bail Reform Act, and that was what changed to a presumption, absent of finding otherwise, at least at the federal level, to release on a signature bond, and then almost immediately after that, now, obviously things take time to speed up, but almost immediately after that, you saw crime explode. I mean, because lots of other states adopted similar things, even though it was only a federal law, states adopted it. Not every state, but a lot of them did.
Yep.
And that continued on, I think, uh, not completely unabated because you had some raises and lowers, but basically it was an upward trend until about 1992, 90 in that area, which the study, and this is probably reaching a little bit, but the study that you based your report on, or the initial study from the Bureau of Justice Statistics about the effectiveness of pretrial release, showed that financial release or surety bail was more effective in guaranteeing appearance. And so then you started to see over the next couple 3 years, you saw a shift from about 60% non-financial releases and 40% financial to a flip the other way, to 60% financial and 40% non-financial. And then you saw crime start to fall off again, um, and continued to fall off until about, like I said, 2012. And 2012, 2014 was when you started to see all these attacks on bail. And so you saw then these jurisdictions, further amplified the number of people that they were letting go in one fashion or another. And COVID then accelerated that even more. So in obviously crime is multifactorial. I mean, you're not going to go, oh, it's just this one thing. But I like to think, and you can dissuade me of this if you want, is that this more lenient release causes an increase in crime. If nothing else, the bail process, because of how it has to be done, because you have to enlist members of your family, somebody like that, to come out and help you get out. The bondsman doesn't just take, oh, you got $1,000 bond, give me $100, you're out the door. They're going to require a mother, a father, a family member, a friend, somebody to come down and get you out. There's a social cost to that you don't get if you're just cycling people back again. It's a speed bump to criminal activity that then your social group is like, hey, what are you doing? So I don't know that there's a whole lot of studies that would support or deny this, but what are your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very plausible. I think the Bail Reform Act was, one of this package of, for better terms, called liberal reforms. I mean, so we then, we had the Miranda rights, as I mentioned, and then the Exclusionary Evidence Act, which says it's one of the weirdest things we have in the United States, right? Which says that if the police collect evidence in a illegal way, then that evidence cannot be used, against the criminal. So the case gets thrown out of court. Seems like a very peculiar way. Like, why should the criminal get the benefit of the police acting illegally? Shouldn't we punish the police? you know, why does the
Probably
criminal?
both, but
Yeah. Well, I think the courts just thought, well, we're going to have a lot of trouble punishing the police, so this is the only way we can sort of enforce this. But it seems very odd, at least to me, that the criminal should benefit from the illegal acts of the police. In any case, there were a lot of things like this, and yeah, I think then that it accumulates. One of them is fine, and the second one is okay, but then it accumulates, and then you get more crime. And then, as I said, the police can become overwhelmed. So the 1970s, even as crime was going up, the number of people in prison per crime was going down. So it was only later that the number of people in prison per crime started to catch up. So it takes time. It takes time to reallocate resources. So I think what we need to just keep in mind is that, to give you an example, auto crime, went way down, right? We had
right.
these keys, which make it difficult to take off with a car, and so forth. And you might have thought, oh, well, we're a less criminal-genic society, things are better off, whatever. But then a few people noticed that some Kias and Hyundais did not have these special keys. So they put out a few TikTok videos of how you could easily steal these cars. And auto theft, particularly of these types of cars, but of others as well, in some cities has gone up by a factor of 10.
Oh yeah.
Factor of 10. So that tells me at least that there's a lot of criminality hiding, under the surface of an otherwise smooth stream. And we just need to be prepared for that so that when it, rears its head, we have enough police force to kind of tamp that down. Because if we let it get too far out of control, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because crime builds upon crime, as pushes the punishment rates down, makes it more difficult to put people in prison. Prisons get overcrowded and so forth and so forth. So I think we just need to be on guard.
Well, in that same vein, there's a Twitter page called at CWB Chicago, which is one of these sites that goes around and talks about how crime is going on or the courts are doing something wrong. And there was one from a couple years ago, and I'll just read this. It's a felon. It says felony bond court highlight, and this was before they went to their releases without bond completely. The defendant says, "I don't understand any of this," and the judge says, "Well, you're charged with possession of a stolen motor vehicle." And the defendant says, "I understand that, but why am I getting arrested when everybody else gets away with this shit? This is bullshit."
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the contagion effect in your discussion on the '70s crime. I assume that's an example of the contagion effect.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Your friends are doing it, your friends are getting away with it, you should do it too. And that's how you learn, right? I mean, the criminals, they don't read the statute and say, here's the punishment and here's the expected cost. They look at their friends. And if their friends are doing a lot of crime and getting away with it, then that tells them, hey, I can do it too.
Well, and they're talk to each other. I mean, like we mentioned, it's a small subset of the population that commits the majority of these crimes, and they do communicate amongst themselves. And if you're sitting in custody, backing, well, this is what I did, but even just going back on the street. Um,
Absolutely.
so if we basically what we're getting at is if we engage in the wholesale unaccountable release of criminal defendants, are we not just asking for more crime to come along?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the danger. Um, Now, I think there's an argument that uh, we tend to imprison, as I said, we tend to imprison too many people for too long. I think sentences can be too long. People age out of crime.
Sure.
So, I don't think there's a lot of gain from having super long sentences. Particularly if you think about the trade-offs there. Again, coming back to trade-offs. I mean, imagine the following. You could take one 20-year-old and put them in prison for 40 years. It's 40 years of prison time. Or you could take two 20-year-olds and put them in prison each for 20 years. That's also 40 years of prison time. Now, of those two, I'm pretty sure that putting the two 20-year-olds in prison for 20 years each, that's going to reduce crime more than putting the one criminal in prison for 40 years. So I think there are some changes we can make on the margin. And as I said, I think, what we have done in the United States is we have put fewer resources into policing than in Europe, for example. We often think about Europe as the more civilized, right, compared to America or something like that. But it's true in Europe, the crime rates are lower and they rely less on long prison sentences. But they got more police on the street.
Right.
And the benefit of having the police on the street is that the crime never happens in the first place. You have deterrence.
Right.
Some of my work is showing that more police on the street is actually a very effective way of reducing crime. And then you don't have to imprison people because they don't commit the crime in the first place. So, there are things that we can do, not just that, but even simple things like lighting, more lighting. Uh, I'm not a big, pro surveillance guy, but, more cameras, I think all of these things are beneficial and can reduce crime.
Well, let's talk about Chicago in that vein just a little bit, because one of the things that was in the news recently was Chicago was dismantling several of their shot spotter,
Mhm, mhm.
microphones and stuff, and shock of shocks, now we're finding bodies, in areas that were previously covered. But the Safety Act, and then Illinois going to a zero bail system with a smattering of preventive detention as well. And the powers that be there are somewhat proselytizing about this, but they're claiming that the zero bail policy is working fabulously. There hasn't been an increase in crime, and everybody's going to court. However, the court clerk who recently lost her reelection after the election posted an op-ed, and essentially she said, numbers wise, in the first 50 weeks of the PFA, which was the Pretrial Fairness Act, or which was a portion of the Safety Act, out of 90,872 cases, defendants missed court 67,460 times, or 16 times. And that included defendants charged with violent felonies. However, what they were doing on that is they've essentially redefined what it means to fail to appear. So
Mm,
you don't get counted as a failure to appear unless they issue a warrant. And
mm.
so they indicated that those 67,000 that she listed there, that's 67,000 reminder postcards that were sent out advising these people of new court dates after they'd already failed to appear. And the courts are going, well, I mean, that's a 75% failure to appear rate out of 90-some thousand
Yeah,
cases.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so, let me try and bring this back to an economist. So, how does someone like yourself properly evaluate the performance of programs like this if the stakeholders simply redefine the problem out of existence?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, understanding the statistics is, incredibly important. You really do have to, get right into the weeds to figure out sometimes what's going on because, yeah, people manipulate these things, all the time. So, uh, as you have done, you gotta go into some, detail to figure out the truth. And I think, look, ultimately, a lot of this is gonna backfire, because you take away the judge's the thing about bail is you can kind of, fine tune it, right? You
Right.
more or less, you can kind of fine tune it, and, it gives judges an option. Now, if you take away that option, but judges still have to respond to the public ultimately, and the public sees rising crime rates, okay, and the public gets upset, right, at the crime they see on the street, at the crime that happens to their families, at the crime they see on the televisions, the people who get murdered, Chicago every single day, you know, they get upset. what are the judges going to do? Well, they're just going to start uh, holding people indefinitely. They're going to start, you know, uh, putting people into the jail instead of a bail,
Right.
right? So no one's going to ever say it has to be the case, right? Not everyone can be released on their own recognizance. The police come and they capture some guy who's in the middle of stabbing somebody. That
Right.
person's not going to be released on their own recognizance. So judges always have the option of just keeping them in jail. And if that's the only option that you give judges, that's what they're going to do. That's what they're going to do. So ultimately, getting rid of cash bail may actually lead to more people being held before trial.
Well, and that's exactly what's happened in the federal system. Prior to the Bail Reform Act of 1984, which authorized preventive detention, only about 25% of people in the federal system remained in custody for the duration of their pretrial, whereas 75% got out on some sort of pretrial release, whether it was
Yeah.
bond or some sort of monitoring. That has completely flipped. Now, if you're arrested in the federal system, 75% of people remain in custody without bond for the duration of their charge until there's a sentencing or a trial. I mean, so we haven't seen that in these state courts yet, but that's also we're in the early stages of it.
Yeah.
You don't have this political backlash. I mean, there's an argument right now that the Republican majority in the House that they picked up in 2020 can, or I'm sorry, in 2022 can be tied directly to bail reform. I mean, the argument on this is that the Republican lead is solely because it is a slim lead, but is solely due to the House seats that were flipped in the state of New York.
Mm.
And all of those New York races were run on, "Hey, you Democrats are soft on crime. I'm gonna come in as a Republican and be tougher on crime." And that soft on crime related directly back to New York's bail reform, that was enacted in 2020. So, I mean, you would think, that, at some point, the party pushing this would be like, "Hey, maybe we should, back off this just a little bit. It's costing us not only votes, but it's costing us leadership." Um, but the concern I have is that what you brought up before is, the people on the other side now, they're not like, "Oh, well, we just need to restore the old system because the old system was working just fine. We need to go completely the other direction over here and keep people in custody with that." And that's what we're seeing in other places. Indiana, state of Tennessee, they're looking at
Right.
constitutional amendments to take away the right to bail altogether. Just
Yep.
leave that up to the courts. So you're a good prognosticator on this stuff. Where do you think we're heading on this?
I'm not sure I'm a good prognosticator. Um, I think a lot depends upon the national crime rate. Um, you know, look, the it's definitely the case that there are signs of the system cracking in certain places. San Francisco, most famously, right? I mean, now in stores, people walk into the store, everything is under lock and key.
Mhm.
Okay. And like, it's incredible. In San Francisco, you're shopping now. It's not uncommon. I think a lot of people have seen someone come into the store, just grab stuff off the shelf and walk out. And if you haven't seen it in person, you've definitely seen it, on Twitter or on
Sure,
TikTok, right? And that just tells you, it tells the criminals that these are easy marks,
sure.
okay? And it tells the voters and the citizens that things are out of control. And they're going to demand, just as we saw with, the border. I'm actually a pro-immigration guy, but just the fact that the border became out of control, so many people pouring over it, tells you that you're in a system of chaos, of disorder, and that worries people, and it especially worries them when it comes to crime. So I think we have saw in this election a backlash, um, uh, partly due to, as David Frum had said, a lot of the blue cities, the Democrat controlled cities, they looked like they've let crime out of control. And when these visual signs of crime get out of control, that's other crimes start to increase as well, right? That was one of the really smart things which Rudy Giuliani did in New York was cut down on the graffiti. Now,
Right.
you might say that the graffiti, well, what's the big deal? But the graffiti tells you, are you living in a place where the police have control, or are you living in a place where the gangs have control?
Right.
And if you
Am I safe?
exactly, exactly. So it's just telling you, it's just a sign both to the criminals. There's a lot of graffiti. Well, that means that shoplifting is not such a problem. That means that mugging is not such a problem, right? Well, instead, if you send the signal that we're going to eliminate the graffiti and we're going to make sure that if you put some graffiti up, then it'll be gone the next day. See, that's what I'm talking about when it comes to tamping it down, because if you have a if you have a system where the graffiti is painted over the next day, well, then it doesn't make sense to do the graffiti in the first place,
Right.
right? But you need enough resources so that you can commit to that policy. Because if there's a sudden, upswing in graffiti and the graffiti is not eliminated, it's left there for a few weeks, well, then you're going to get more. And then you're not going to have the resources to get rid of that. And it's going to get more. And again, you get the snowball effect. So you have to have enough resources, more than you think you need, to handle the natural ups and downs, and to send that signal always. Nope, that this graffiti is going to be eliminated within 48 hours, and then people won't do it, and you'll be in a low crime equilibrium. But if you let it out, you let that genie out of the bottle, you may find yourself very quickly in a system which you can no longer handle.
Well, then it becomes really hard in that second, the second example there, where it's out of control to even get the resources to fix the problem because you're
Exactly.
decimating your tax base. I mean, getting the resources, that's all tax revenue, and that's going to come from people that are functioning and working and doing things in an environment that they feel safe and prosperous, and you're protecting property rights and all that.
Exactly.
But if that
Yeah.
gets out of control, well, look what's happened to the tax base in cities like San Francisco, where these commercial buildings are selling for, dimes or pennies on the dollar.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. That was a big problem in the 1970s in New York. No accident that crime was going up at the same time as the city was going bankrupt. Both of these things, both of these things were cause and effect,
Right. Self-perpetuating.
in a vicious circle. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So, we've taken almost an hour here, so, we'll kinda wrap this up. What else are you working on? I saw your blog post this morning called "Regulating Sausages," and I'm currently reading Justice Gorsuch's book behind me, Overruled, and, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are doing their Doge thing. Or do you think we're looking at some sort of, minor rollback of the administrative state? Is that, where we're looking going for the next few years?
So, yeah, again, trying to get me to prognosticate. Look, I would say that under Trump administration, the variance of things which can happen has increased. Okay. And both on the good side and on the bad side. On the bad side, I think Trump could go crazy on tariffs. I'm an economist. I'm more of a free trade guy. He could go crazy on deporting people. We do need to control the border, but I'm not in favor of, huge deporting people who've been here a long time. I mean, I think that would be extremely disruptive to the economy and would be terribly unjust as well. So there's a lot of bad things which could happen. Okay. On the other hand, there's a lot of good things which could happen, because things can happen under Trump, which could happen under no other president, both bad
True.
and good, and I'm hopeful that Elon Musk and Vivek can reduce, yeah, some of the overregulation which we have in the United States. And I'm also hopeful that we are turning the road on a pro-progress, pro-technology, pro-economic growth society. Like, I think one of the things which makes Elon Musk so interesting is that he is genuinely maybe the greatest entrepreneur of all time. He's multiple companies, Tesla, SpaceX, the Boring Company, that's really unprecedented. Steve Jobs didn't do that on so many different levels. This idea of going to Mars, I think it's a return to a kind of muscular, pro-growth of the United States. We're going to build some nuclear power plants. I mean, I think that's great. Microsoft is going to restart 3 Mile Island. I think that's fantastic. I think there's an idea we're going to reduce permitting. Permitting has made it incredibly difficult to build houses in the United States. Like, we can solve all of these problems. These are policy problems. They're technological problems. They are not insolvable problems. We could have a huge growth of housing in the United States if we want it. And I would recommend my colleague Brian Kaplan's book, Build, Baby, Build. It's a graphic novel. It's fantastic on the housing crisis and how to solve it. It's a lot of fun. But I think we can do these things. Trump is a developer. Like, maybe, this is time to be pro-development. So, the variance has increased. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think there's opportunity both for good things and for bad things, and maybe we can push them in the good direction.
Well, you sound more optimistic than pessimistic, which it's
Hopeful,
nice. Most of
hopeful.
my guests that come on here, we're talking about bail, so we're all pessimistic about things. So we
Right,
like to
right.
have the optimism. Well, Professor, I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk with us. I've used your fugitive study, I mean, countless times in advocating for bail. I mean, as the vice president of the association, and my job is also legislative chair, and so I get to go talk to the legislature, and I've pounded away, with your data, going, hey, we really got to have this bail. So it's been, it's been a godsend. We don't get that a whole lot on this end of things, and I really do appreciate the work that you've done. And in all honesty, just getting ready for this, the marginal revolution thing. I know I've added a whole bunch of stuff to my Twitter feed and my YouTube account, so I'm sure I'll be seeing a lot more of that stuff because it really is interesting.
Well, thanks, Shane. It's great talking with you. I learned a lot.
All right, well, thank you very much. We would like to thank our guest, Dr. Alex Tabarrok, for taking the time to speak with us today. Please visit marginalrevolution.com and mru.org to see more of this kind of economic analysis. It's really interesting. Trying to figure out the consequences of the actions we take as a society and being able to look at those with clear eyes is so important on a variety of issues. It's a skill that doesn't get applied enough in our current political environment. We largely make emotional decisions and then try to find data to support our feelings. But being able to step back and look at the actual data is probably more helpful than screaming at each other. But we hope that you'll join us at the next episode of the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we'll continue to bring you critical information and non-screaming conversations with people involved in the criminal justice system.
Join us again next time for the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf and executive produced by David Stuckman.